Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back to The Curious Collector and the new episode this week. I'm coming to you actually from Detroit, Michigan. I haven't mentioned it as of yet, but some people know, most people do, that I'm on a 57-date tour around America speaking to doll clubs and doll organizations throughout this year. So it has been a wild ride so far. Let me tell you, I have been in Lakeland, Florida, Eustis, Florida, Knoxville, Tennessee, Indianapolis, and tomorrow I'm in Lansing and then Detroit, and just keep going from there. 57 locations all over the U.S. So a lot of the podcasts for the remainder of the year are going to be from some random hotel somewhere in America, and this time coming to you from Detroit. But it has been really an amazing experience. You know, a lot of people ask, Stuart, why are you doing this? And I would tell you it's for the Jell-O mold. It's become a real joke. I always say I've eaten more Jell-O mold than any man in America because of all the doll clubs. They love Jell-O mold for some reason. Well, they used to. I guess it's not a thing now, but it kind of caught on about my Jell-O mold joke. So at every one of these doll talks, they're presenting me with a unique Jell-O mold, including my favorite so far in Charleston, South Carolina. At the Charm of Charleston Doll Club, Deborah Jenkins presented me with a Jell-O mold with a Barbie inside of it, which kind of stood on the top and danced around as the Jell-O mold wiggled, which was quite humorous in itself because there's a bit of a costume malfunction, let's call it. And they had a whipped cream topping on the top, and apparently it melted. And so when it came out, well, it was now a topless Barbie. So it was quite an interesting moment, and everybody was laughing hysterically. And if you go to my Facebook page, you'll be able to see pictures of the presentation of this to me and my rather shocked face. So anyway, it's been great, wonderful people. Why am I putting myself through this? Oh my gosh. I guess if I could sum it up, I'm doing it not just because I love communicating with people and I love sharing stories and I love inspiring collectors in certain ways through my experiences, but I'm doing it partly as well for me because you are all inspiring me. Meeting collectors in their space, in their moment, in their comfortable zone, and listening to them as well. And having a conversation is one of the greatest experiences you can have, which kind of counters the idea of a podcast, which is just me talking to an endless crowd all across the world who I never get to see their faces or interact with them regarding it. But with this, I really get to listen to you as well. And I love this opportunity. It's incredible for my growth. I hope it's good for yours. And it's fun. And that's what collecting should be. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you. And each week as we release a new podcast, I'll give you an idea of where I am and maybe a few shout outs to some of the clubs and some of the amazing people I'm meeting along this route. And really, really excited about this year and doing all of this. And one lady said, by the time you get to California in May, you'll be exhausted. And I've responded, no, I'll just be warming up. So let's get it going. So what am I here to talk about today? Well, it's called What the Hell Were They Thinking? And people who know me and have been to my talks and watched me auction know that I have this running joke called What the Hell Were They Thinking? And it's generally related to dolls that you look back and have the advantage of history, armchair quarterbacking, I guess, ideas years later and laughing at them because they're ridiculous. It makes no sense. But maybe back then it did. And I want to talk about that today and give you some of the most unique dolls that I've experienced over the years, some of the thoughts into the design of them, and posing the question of what the hell were they thinking? Because in the reality of it, it's either senseless or It has no actual purpose, or it could be confusing to a child even if it was made for a child. So it's kind of a fun one today, but a little bit of history too involved. One of the things that I've really fascinated by over the years, the whole trend towards doing patents for different unique aspects, designs, not just in dolls, of course, but in everything. I mean, patents have been around since the 15th century. People have been deposing, as they say in France, or patenting here, different trademarks. And it's very interesting to study it from the context of dolls, which I think offers, even if you collect something else, a good snapshot of the processes of what was behind the thinking of this. So, we look back on dolls and we can see some of the earliest patents being Jacob Petit in France in 1845, I believe. And even in America, we look at the first doll patent that I've been able to recognize is Greiner in 1858 for his particular construction of material for doll heads. And that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of the patents were not necessarily the obvious, like a face. How do you patent a doll face or a doll head unless it has some unique feature like Kubelka with inserted hair? What exactly are they patenting? A doll is a doll. A lot of times it was some unique element. A good part of the time happened to focus on bodies and the way the body was constructed or articulated, or as well, something mechanical related to that particular doll. It could be a keywind mechanism, something along those lines. And the French were by far, I would say, the forerunners of experimenting with doll designs and throwing out patents left and right, hoping for that one big thing. I mean, if I look back on doll history in France, Jules Nickelsteiner was probably the leading person in France at the time of experimenting with unique mechanical movements or construction, because he was, I believe, a clockmaker or a clock mechanical engineer by trade. So that was his background, and he understood the mechanism functions of pieces that would have movement. So he was patenting different unique designs on a regular basis. But all the French companies were. And a lot of it is trying to think back on these times. They didn't have marketing research. They didn't have data to analyze consumer trends or spending. What was big at the time? How did you find out? How did you know? You kind of created it. So these were Wild West days of designing dolls. The doll designers, we think of them as artists, right? We think of them as sculptors, and they created, and they wanted to create these beautiful faces, these angelic looking dolls that were almost an idealized child in a way. But what we don't realize is that a lot of them also were kind of engineers. So that's engineering part of the doll maker, like Jules Nickelsteiner, would come into play in what they would create. But they didn't have any data to go by. So they just were kind of at the time throwing spaghetti against the wall. Some of the stuff took off and worked, like the Steiner Gigatur was a success, but other things weren't. And interestingly, now have become many of the really rare dolls that you seldom find. So it's a fascinating look at history, the successes, the failures, the why of each, and how they did it. And the reality is, there wasn't a big committee sitting down and trying to figure out exactly what would be successful. It was just, as I said before, spaghetti against the wall. Let's see how it sells. And some of it did, a lot of it didn't. So I want to share with you some of my favorites out there that I've dealt with over the years that have become very humorous moments at auctions when I'm selling them. And mind you, a couple of things. Don't assume that these dolls are terrible dolls or something. Many of them are incredibly valuable, incredibly sought after, and should be respected by collectors today. But they have kind of a funny feature, a unique feature that always leads to that question, what the hell were they thinking? And as I'm talking about some of these examples, I realized one of the disadvantages of podcasts is you don't have necessarily the visual of being able to instantly see something pop up that I'm talking about. So as you're listening, just Google the terms that I'm telling you, and I guarantee you'll find them and you'll be able to look at them in detail and get a feeling for the idea of their construction and how they present. So the first one, the Armand Marseille doll with retractable teeth. So for those who are not necessarily doll collectors, let me just explain as well that the Armand Marseille company is one of the most prolific firms of the 19th and early 20th century. And they were a massive distributor of dolls all over the world. And many of the most common German bisque dolls of that time period that are found today were made by Armand Marseille. So this was not just some small company. This was a very important piece of doll history during that period. So the Armand Marseille company was clearly probably experimenting with different ideas. And one of them they came about to create, and I've always tried to imagine like Fritz and Matthias, the doll designers in Armand Marseille, sitting at a table and trying to come up with their new big design that they could patent. And by golly, they came up with this idea. A doll that when you lay it down, the lower teeth retract into the head. What? They did this. I'm trying to understand what the reasoning behind all of this was. I've experimented this myself. I've laid down earlier before the podcast to just verify and confirm the fact that my teeth did not retract when I laid down. So they remained exactly in the same spot. I also consulted with Karen Cheek, a noted legendary doll collector who happens to be a dental professional. And I asked her, Karen, is there any particular relationship or association to, what do I call it, the human teeth experience that someone's teeth would retract? And she said, well, as a surgeon, I hope never on my chair. So no, it doesn't exist. There's nothing related to anything in the human experience about teeth retracting. So what was the purpose of this? I mean, the only thing I could think of is that maybe in 1905, people's teeth did retract and we just never learned about it. But I probably was trying to think that maybe parents would buy this for their child to say, now lay the doll down, see how the teeth retract. That's what happens if you don't brush your teeth at night. Now go brush them right now. But it definitely ranks for me as the most curious of doll creations. And every time one comes for auction, we always demonstrate it. And people are just kind of like, what? But it's a really sought after doll. People really do like it. It's one of the more popular of the Armand Marseille character dolls that was produced because it is, I guess, look, we talk about stories being really the most important aspect of dolls, especially if you're showing them to other people. And what could be a better story than showing this to visitors in your home and saying, watch this, the teeth retract. And it's looking at their faces as they witness this incredible creation. So the next one on my list, and this is always one that comes up in everybody's conversation about strange doll patents over the years, and that's the Ondine Swimmer. Ondine, Ondine. And you can actually Google this and you can watch videos of it working, but it came with a mechanical mechanism that moves the arms and the legs in a swimming movement and was supposed to be or marketed as a doll that could actually swim. Now, it's a bisque-headed doll with like a cork and composition body. So the cork obviously meant to allow for it to float. And then when you wind it, it should ultimately swim through the water. But does it really? I don't know. I've never tried one, nor am I going to, because the reality is it's got a mechanical mechanism or a mechanism inside of it. Why would you submerge this in water? it seems to me that it's an instant disaster and that the mechanism is going to jam up or rust out and it's going to break. And then furthermore, I just look at this thing and I feel the weight of it and I look at the movements and I don't think it's going to swim. I really think it's going to fall to the bottom of the pool or the lake or wherever a child would put this doll in. The irony of all this is really fascinating. The inventor of this, who patented it, his name was Martine. And it was actually all the rage when it was introduced at one of the World Expositions and won numerous awards for its unique design. He did this because as a child growing up, he had an aversion to water. He was terrified of water and terrified of swimming. And so he wanted to create this doll to allow children to see the idea of what swimming is in the water by utilizing the doll. But the question is, did it really swim? Because if you have a child with an aversion to water and you give this doll to them and they put it in there, I personally think the thing is going to fall to the bottom. That is not exactly selling the idea of swimming to this child. No, my doll just sunk. I mean, but anyway, it is definitely one of the most unique creations. And the videos are always funny. Now, I have heard rumors that there is a video somewhere of this thing actually swimming in water. So if any of you find this link, you please send it to me because I have searched for months for this and have not been able to find anything. The only thing I could find, this is my favorite video that's online, is somebody did a video of the Ondine swimmer on top of a glass of water and doing the movements. So I guess that was to show at least water in the equation. But anyway, definitely a top one in the what the hell were they thinking? The storyline is lovely. I mean, the purpose of it and the idea behind it of what inspired it. But the reality is, well, I don't think it's going to really help any child in this aversion to water. So number 3 on this list that I have is any doll made of celluloid. Now, I realize the importance of celluloid and how it was invented in the predecessor to plastics. And it was a unique and different material that was created at that time and a great invention at its moment. But the reality is for dolls, it has to be one of the most unbelievably poor choices of a material to ever make a child's plaything. It's very fragile. I mean, you can poke a hole in it with your finger. It's highly toxic. It's highly flammable. It can break into pieces that are sometimes sharp and could cut a child. It could break into pieces they could choke on. I mean, if you could invent any material to make a child plaything, why? What did they think behind this? Now, I've talked with Florence about it, and Florence's theory on celluloid is that at the time it was made, perhaps it was more durable or it felt more durable, that only the aging of celluloid makes it so fragile. I don't know. I can't speak for that. I wasn't in the 1920s to see them coming out new, but there is no question that now they are, well, let's just say celluloid dolls are probably going to be getting rarer and rarer over time. Maybe they will end up being one of the rarest dolls in the world, but collectors don't invest a lot in them. A funny story. I was in Germany and I was working on a collection that had a number of celluloid dolls. And I was handling them and working with the packers and coordinating. And there were many other dolls in the collection as well, but there were celluloid dolls. So I was handling them and helping to pack them because they are so delicate. Well, later that day, I ended up going to the airport. And for the first time, if you know the swabs they do on your hands sometimes to test you for explosive material that you might have handled, I actually tested positive in a German airport for explosive materials with the swab test, was brought into a room and was heavily questioned. Why is this? Why do you have this material on your hand? And I had to explain to them the only thing I could think of, celluloid dolls I had been handling earlier. They eventually let me go, thank goodness. I can tell they were not particularly understanding of my excuse of celluloid, but there it is. At least it made for a good story. And then, of course, my favorite ever celluloid item that I've sold were, are you ready? A box set of electric Christmas lights made out of celluloid. Wow. Now talk about a safety hazard. Put that on a dry tree. Celluloid Christmas lights, electrified. A recipe for disaster indeed. So speaking of dolls that, well, I don't know why you would create this for a child, especially with a bisque head, but those that come on built-in roller skates. Yes, there are actually German bisque dolls that were produced that the body, and I believe French as well, where the body has like skates on the bottom that you can wind up the doll and it will skate, or sometimes you just push it along and it will skate. Now, okay, if you're going to put a durable head on it, that's fine. But a bisque head? Can you imagine how many of these the child gets it on Christmas morning, winds it up, lets it go? It's going to fall quickly, obviously, and the head is going to break. I mean, if ever a doll needed a helmet, please let it be the bisque one on roller skates. Well, let me just say this. You don't see them often, and we probably know why. Now, the fifth doll in this list is the one that I actually have talked about this before, and that is the next two actually I've talked about before in previous podcasts. So it may seem familiar, but I'm going to reintroduce them again here for people who haven't heard about them because they really are wild creations. The Bebe Gourmand by Casimir Bru. Now, Bru did a number of really unique patents over the years, including the Brutateur, which was the nursing Bru. There was the musical Bru, which you wind up the body and it plays music. Number really unique. And the dolls themselves are fabulous, beautiful. But the Bebe Gourmand, yes, while beautiful, has a very unique construction that when you put a biscuit in the mouth, a little tiny biscuit. Now, we don't know if Bru actually made a biscuit for this or not. It's never been seen before, an actual original one. But when you put this little cube of something inside the mouth, there is a mechanism in the body, tubes, that it runs through and goes all the way down the leg and deposits out of the bottom of the feet. Even with shoes, were designed for it with this flap that opens up. So the biscuit will come right through the foot and you just open the flap and it pops right out. Okay, why? Why would you design this? I get the idea and I get the intrigue of being able to put a biscuit actually in the mouth of the doll and being able to retrieve it. But the fact that it comes out of the bottom of the foot for a child had to be one of the most confusing things they've ever experienced. I mean, I'm trying to imagine all of these, because this was an expensive doll, very, very luxury boutique doll. All of these very wealthy, proper young French children getting this doll and seeing it pop out of the bottom of the feet and thinking to themselves, I never knew I could do that. And then going promptly to the toilet and feeling the urge and sticking their feet in there, waiting for something to come out. I mean, it had to be the most confusing thing to a child to ever see. Now, not that having it come out of the more appropriate area would have been better. That probably could have been equally disturbing. So maybe, I don't know, have it come out of the stomach, something else. But this one definitely is the top for me of what the hell were they thinking? And it is a really rare piece, and why we know. Oh, while I'm talking about French dolls, I have to throw in, too, a little honorable mention of what the hell they were thinking. And that is the French court dolls of the 18th century that were made in France. Now, these are a very unique genre of dolls that have a very, very significant following of top-end collectors because they are historically important, beautifully created, and some of the earliest examples of European dolls produced. But they come with one unique feature, often depicting French royalty. And Francois Timer did an entire book about these dolls that I highly recommend, if you can find one, to pick one up. It is in French, but you can use Google Translate to help you through it to learn a little bit about the background and history. However, if you get this book, you'll be able to get a lot of glimpses into the unique features they have. That is, how do I say it? They're anatomically correct. Very correct, probably more correct than we need to know, especially in the case of the French men. So many of them are male figures, and they have rather large, yes, that. And I mean, I would imagine that this is only as a French man could imagine himself, meaning generous. And so they definitely go on the list. When you see them in person, just sitting on a shelf fully dressed, you think, my gosh, these are fantastic. They're beautiful. But if you undress one, you will have that surprise and you will be left to ask that question again, what the hell were they thinking? The sixth one I've also talked about before, and that's the German baby dolls. A lot of them made by Cameron Reinhardt, bisque heads. They're often very large too, like almost life-size babies that came with wind-up mechanical eyes. So you would wind this up, and it had a clockwork mechanism, meaning that the eyes would literally go for 30 minutes with a good winding, and they move back and forth on their own. The thoughts, first of all, of a child having this doll, because they were big, is rather odd. And then the thoughts of them having this in bed at night and holding the doll and watching the eyes in the dark moving back and forth. Talk about terrifying a child. It's horrible. But I always say they do serve a really great purpose for doll collectors today. If you can find one, and they're fairly rare, we know why. If you can find one, they serve a really good purpose for when you have house guests that kind of have overstayed their welcome and you really just want them to leave. You put this in their room at night, wind it up while they're brushing their teeth or whatever, and then sneak back out. And they're going to get to bed and they're going to look over and see this doll's eyes moving back and forth. I guarantee you they are gone in the morning and they are never coming back. So there is practical purposes to be had with this particular creation. Number 7, the Kessner Wunderpuppen. Yes, it was called the Wunderpuppen. It's a wonder, all right. It came in a box, and you would have a normal bisque-headed doll sitting in the box, and then you would have 3 other heads that you could remove the head the body comes on, and you put one of these other heads on there. So it was interchangeable with different heads that really weren't all that different necessarily. But I guess if you were tired of one look, you could go for the other, even though it was fairly similar. But my point being, if anyone who's a doll collector knows the intricacy of popping, as we call it, or removing a bisque head off of a body. It's a delicate procedure that, if you don't know what you're doing, can go wrong quickly. So why would you give this to a child and imagine that they could just simply pop a head off of a composition body, a bisque head, and reattach a new one? I mean, this is something doll collectors even dread doing. But a child? Interestingly, there were later creations similar to this. The family doll set, if any of you have seen those, the composition ones, which I think were 1920s. And now they were more practical. It actually had kind of a screw mechanism on it. So you literally unscrewed the head and you could put another one on. And the heads were all really different. So it would give some variation of kind of a, here you get 10 dolls for the price of one. So that, I kind of get it, but the Wunderpuppen was really not a good design from the perspective of who is going to be popping these heads routinely and changing them out. So number 8, this is always one of my favorite ones. Now, we don't auction these very often because they are very low value for probably a reason. And you really don't see them that often because aesthetically, they are not the most beautiful dolls. And that is dolls made of petrified apples, or as you often hear the term, apple head dolls. Now, I'm not sure who came up with the idea of, oh, here's a petrified apple. Let's make a head out of it. And why not? I guess Kathy Cruz made a doll out of potato heads, or potatoes rather. And Lily Bates also did use potatoes to make dolls. So I guess the concept of food stuffed dolls has been there. But petrified apples are aesthetically probably one of the ugliest things you could ever see. I mean, they look like shriveled, wrinkled. I don't even want to say it. So I don't quite get why anyone would do it. Now, I realize there is that charming sort of folk art aspect of using found materials that spawned this creation of dolls out of interesting different things like petrified fruit. But still, I just don't get it. They're not very pleasing, but I guess a good story. And when I sell them, I always try to use my one selling pitch, because believe me, when you're selling an Applehead doll, you need anything you can grab hold of. My pitch always being that, well, at least in a dystopian world where everyone's running out of food and you have nothing left to eat, you could at least eat your dolls. Well, on second thought, you probably don't want to. So the next one, number 9, 2 and 3 face dolls. So these are the dolls. A lot of times they were made with bisque heads early on in the 19th century. And later you had, really even going up into the 1950s and 60s, dolls that you could just turn the head and a different face would appear. And I've always questioned this, that wouldn't this be traumatizing to a child? I mean, that scene in The Exorcist was made for a reason, and you all know what I'm talking about. So why would being able to switch a head and you have a screaming face and then you turn it, you have a smiling face and another one, just a normal sort of stoic face, why would this necessarily be comforting to a child? I don't get it. But here's the unique thing. They actually were, I would assume, rather popular, because you find them quite often out of family homes all over the world. So apparently there was a market for these and they were successful. So maybe it was just pre The Exorcist movie, I guess. And so that back then they thought they were charming. But now I think it would be a pretty hard sell in the marketing world of dolls today. I don't know. It worked before. Maybe it would still work today. Number 10, soap dolls. I'm sure that they thought, oh, this is kind of charming for a child, that you could have a doll made out of soap. And I always joke, at least you know it'll be the cleanest doll you've ever owned in your life. But folks, soap doesn't maintain form once it's used. And the form it ends up being is rather frightening. So imagine a child taking a bath and then witnessing their prized soap doll that they've been holding and cuddling, and it's suddenly headless and shriveled. Talk about disturbing. Again, this poor child is going to be traumatized. Now, I will say, my $1 million idea, and I've never seen this unless somebody can tell me otherwise, but a soap doll dispenser. That is a dispenser of soap made out of a doll. Now, that's the one I think nobody's ever done. And I'm surprised that it doesn't exist. So those are a lot of earlier examples, sort of years ago, that people came up and created. But you would think that designers got better over the years with creations, because as you evolved in time, you get into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, you started having more access to data. You started having more access to understanding consumer trends. More media was present to see how things were developing. And so you would think that mistakes would be far and few between later on in the years. But no, they still kept happening, maybe a little less so than in the early 20th century, because back then it was just a crapshoot of let's see if it works, let's see if it sells. But you had dolls like probably the most famous one of all that was an absolute disaster and also made you really question what the hell were they thinking, was Growing Up Skipper. So the designer of this doll, Bradley, recently shared with me a little of the background story of how it came about. One of the Mattel executives had been shopping with his daughter, and she was needing to buy a training bra. So he went back and he had this epiphany in this moment of thought of a design for a doll. So he went back to Mattel and pitched his idea to all the other executives of a doll that would grow breasts. It would be a child, and then it would age and grow breasts. There's a mechanism that they could create where you could move the arm to make them grow. They all thought it was a great idea, that this would actually sell. And I can tell you, and Bradley told me there are stories about in the Mattel company at the time, there were many people within the firm that refused to work on this doll. They just flatly refused to work on it. And then Carol Spencer actually agreed to go through with it and created the doll, and it did not do well or sit well. And it is kind of one of the what the hell were they thinking moments within the Barbie genre, because Barbie is an interesting one all the way through. Here you have one doll which has so many different developments through its age, that patents or designs or unique features that have evolved over the many years of Barbie. And many of them have been successful. Many of them have not been successful. But in every year, they have to come up with whole new concepts. So it's kind of fascinating to go back, and you could do an entire podcast, or I could, on just the successes and failures of Barbie over the years. And this Growing Up Skipper was definitely one of them, which kind of leads on to a similar type of invention. And this was not Barbie, but Judith the Pregnant Doll, which is one that I have just no idea what anyone was thinking in coming up with the concept of a doll that is pregnant. Not only that, but you open up the stomach and there's a baby sitting inside the stomach of all places. And then even worse, the baby has a spring action loaded mechanism in it that it will pop out on this spring. And then to top it all off, the stomach will go flat after. The whole thing is ridiculous. And I don't imagine why a child would find this appealing or what exactly it was trying to represent or show, because it's not very accurate. And it's really not a necessary toy, I would say, for a child. I mean, was it actually made as a novelty for adults? I don't know, but it definitely is one of the most unusual and bizarre dolls ever created. Tressie is another one. Now, this one was actually kind of successful, but I still kind of don't understand what they were getting at here or what its entire purpose was. But the Tressie doll, when you would press this button on the stomach, you could get the hair to grow. It would actually grow. And then you had a little key, and you would wind the key in the back in this little hole insert, and you could take the hair back up to being shorter again. It would go back and insert. So what's the purpose of the Tressie? I don't get that either. And then the reality is that little key for a child, you lose it and you're stuck with that hair. Now, in real life, for me, I would love an option of just pressing a button on my stomach and my hair would grow. And if you've ever seen my hair, you will understand why. There really isn't any. But for a doll, this one really puzzles me. The Flatsy dolls as well, if you remember Flatsy dolls, which I think were from the 60s. And they were two-dimensional flat dolls. And the whole selling, the whole marketing of these was centered around that you could hide them. Okay, so you could like place them inside of a book. Okay, and why do I need a flat doll? Apparently, there was somewhat of a limited success. I was talking to Tammy, my producer here, the Curious Collector, and she said, oh, I see them all the time. They still exist out there, and there's actually a little collecting market. So we did a quick scan looking online, and sure enough, there were, I think, 468 of them available now on eBay. So they clearly sold some Flatsy dolls back in the years. I don't know what people did with them. I always imagined they would have been lost. I mean, if the whole purpose was a doll that you could actually hide, like inside a book, or something along those lines, well, that's a recipe for losing it very, very quickly. So anyway, this one is always an interesting one. Poor pitiful Pearl. You gave a child a doll that was basically dressed like an orphan in very crude clothing that, again, the only thing I can imagine was perhaps it was to teach a child empathy, but you were given a poor looking child that was basically clothed in fragmented clothing, that like living on the street, and you're supposed to have fun with this. What kind of stories would a child create behind this doll? It makes no sense. But again, another one that actually seemed to have success. And then there are the ones that really had success that, again, I look at today through the eyes of history in my armchair quarterbacking doll designs. And I am very perplexed as to why they became really successful. Like, I mean, beyond successful. They became iconic dolls that created a frenzy in the world. And you already know the first one I'm going to mention, and that's the Cabbage Patch doll. Why? What about this doll was so alluring that would create such an absolute worldwide frenzy of people fighting in the stores to be able to get this doll? It's really not all that appealing. The designer, Xavier Roberts, I'm not quite sure what he was doing at the time, but he created this whole concept of the doll came out of like the dust of angels. I don't know the whole story, but it's rather bizarre and very kind of hippie-ish. And I don't know what he was taking at the moment when he created the whole storyline of Cabbage Patch, but it's fairly bizarre. And yet they became a sensation. And he became outrageously wealthy as a result. But it could have very easily gone the other direction. That doll, just like Barbie, actually, in the beginning, could have very easily gone the other direction because it was not well received its first year or two. And it was a rather gutsy move to design a doll that was so featured. So, yeah, sometimes they are successful. And then troll dolls. I mean, I look at these dolls and I think there is nothing appealing. I get it. They're kind of kitschy. They're funny. Some people say, oh, they just make me smile. But could they create the sensation that they did? I never would have imagined this. And even today seem to have a bit of a collector following. And they still, I believe they still make troll dolls today and sell them. But you would look at this and the initial concept of it and wonder why you would come up with this idea. These would never sell. So maybe sometimes the spaghetti on the wall theory actually does work. Just throw it out there. Let's see what happens. I always imagine, because one of the people, if we want to step back in time to like the 1920s, George Borgfeldt, who I have loved studying over the years, was a really interesting figure, was really one of the major distributors of dolls, and not creator, but he was the person that would find designers to come up with different unique designs for dolls that he could have produced in Germany or the US, hoping that it would become a huge success. So he would try many, many different designs from many different artists. And one of them that, again, I can't imagine why it became so popular, but it did, the Bilo Baby. If you look at this doll, it doesn't exactly exude a lot of charm. It's interesting and it's supposed to represent as close to an infant baby as possible, but it's rather unique looking. And if I was sitting in the boardroom with George Borgfeldt and Grace Story Putnam came in with this design, I personally would have looked at him and said, this is never going to sell. I don't see people buying this doll. Yet, lo and behold, in 1923, it became the $1 million baby. Everybody had a Bilo, and now everybody still has a Bilo. And it became an iconic doll of that particular period. But it very easily could have gone the other way. So maybe Borgfeldt was right. Just don't question it. Just make it. Throw it out there. See what happens. If it really goes, we'll just make more and more and more. So it is one approach behind this. So that's sort of my my little take on a few of my favorite what the hell were they thinking dolls over the years and discussing it. It's really fun to kind of go back and look at the different designs and to think about what went into it, to understand the theories of these were not always based in what we imagine to be art or doll designers in a classic sense, but that there was engineering behind this as well. And engineering in the sense of trying to create the next big thing. And there must have been a race. I mean, as one doll maker would patent one thing, another one would race to patent another thing. Everybody was racing to find that next big thing. And it probably will continue to go on in history, even with all the data, even with all the marketing research that we have today in recognizing what would probably sell and what may not. There are still going to be mistakes. And so I'm sure that in the coming years ahead, we will have more dolls that will make future podcasts in What the Hell Were They Thinking?
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.